Thank you. Welcome back. And thank you for clicking on the second link. We've got a little more of the presentation that we started in the previous link. Julia is going to describe a few other companies. And as you'll recall from that first presentation, what we're talking about here is devising theater models, that is practicing theater in a so-called devised theater setting that challenge typical notions of hierarchy in the theater, and how we as artists can create a more sort of democratic space through our devising practices. Julia, thank you for taking us through this. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. And yes, thank you for joining us for part two. So at the end of the last video, I was talking about a company called Urban Bush Women. And in the previous video, I set up this spectrum of the ways that companies work, the ways that they devise or collectively create. And we were kind of tracing it from tyranny to anarchy. And I talked more about that in the first video, but I'm going to continue that here and place Urban Bush Women where I see them is kind of one step further on that spectrum, whereas the team, which is the first company I talked about in the first video, gives a lot of agency to its actors. That I was saying that the actors are almost like the director or the playwright of their character. With Urban Bush Women, the director or the artistic director of the company has a lot more shaping power, or she's the editor of the material. It's slightly less collectively created, but I've put them there because they still take a lot of their inspiration and source material from the lives of the performers. So real life experiences. And with all of their community work, they're actively incorporating real stories from real people's lives that then she edits into a piece of theater. The next company I'd love to talk about is also American. They're called the City Company. The City Company is a wonderful company that I have been honored to train with. I did their summer training institute in 2008, and they have been working since the early 90s. They're led by Anne Bogart, who, in addition to being a director and a professor of theater at Columbia University, has written many books about theater, and perhaps her most famous book is A Director Prepares. She was the person who made me want to be a director, and her company is distinguished by a dedication to physical training. So it's a pretty set group of people who have been training in these two styles since they all came together. You can see here, one of the styles is Suzuki and the other is Viewpoints. And I won't show the clips now, but here at the bottom of the PowerPoint, there are some links to people training in these physical approaches. Another thing I should say about all these companies is you might be watching them and say, that looks more like dance than theater to me. And I think that is really smart and a really good question. That actually that's true. A lot of these companies who work more collectively live on the edge of dance and theater. And yeah, it's interesting to me that, you know, maybe the playwright model lends itself, or someone might make the argument that it lends itself to a more word-based, text-based approach. And perhaps working as a group to make something may lend itself to working physically. I'm sure someone could argue the opposite, but what I would say is that for all of these companies, if you go back to the first video, I talked about tracing them back to Brecht, that there has, in that whole line of kind of more event-based theater, or what he called epic theater, there is a dedication to physical storytelling, storytelling, yeah, that doesn't rely on people speaking in conversation for us to understand what's going on. So the City Company makes all kinds of incredible works, but there's a particular strand of work that is inspired by visual artists. And they made a series of shows that were kind of, yeah, they were meant to express the body of work of a visual artist. I'm going to show you a clip from a show called Bob Rauschenberg America, all lowercase, one word. And it was inspired by the artist Robert Rauschenberg.
While you're setting that up, a question has occurred to me, and I want to ask you. We're talking here about these devising strategies in a kind of rehearsal space and how that can be brought about through these more democratic, inclusive, anti-hierarchical methods. But then post-production in our society, in the world we live in, do you find that sometimes a more hierarchical model is ultimately produced post-production, where somebody's the director and goes and gives the interview with the newspaper as the director, or somebody, is identified by the reviewers as the writer and then becomes the writer or the focal point, person, Anne Bogart, for example, so if you're going to talk to City Company, you would want to interview her. Do you find sort of post-production that a more traditional model sometimes gets born?
I know what you mean, almost foist upon the
There you
group.
go. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I think you're right about that. And I think some companies try to resist that by insisting on multiple people. The City Company, for example, has a joint leadership model. So I think there's a co-artistic director model. Anne doesn't always call the shots. And I am familiar with companies who, they will resist being reduced to one person. They will, they'll say, no, you have to interview both of us or three of us. I think in all these conversations, it's not what we're used to. And it doesn't fit nicely into the way that we understand how theater is made. What you're also making me think about is how, like in the world of reviews and feature articles and things, I do think we're really addicted to the idea of the genius artist and the owner of the work. So it's an interesting observation.
I mean, I guess the takeaway as I'm thinking about it now is, in order to maintain that sort of democratic model, there's really two places to think about. There's the rehearsal space, which is what we're talking about today. But then it strikes me that there's a second post-production space where some companies are probably, and some individuals are more successful than others at maintaining that kind of democratic division after the show has been performed or after it's opened, and then there's interviews being given out or the script gets published, and inevitably a script publisher is like, well, who's the playwright? We need somebody's name on that line. And it seems to me maybe some companies have been more successful than others at kind of maintaining that democratic space post-production, but it requires vigilance there too. Like, it's not just, but it's this post area too that must require a lot of vigilance out of the artists to maintain this democratic space.
Absolutely. And I think there's also embedded in the way I'm talking about these companies is there's kind of a question for me, which is that once you get to the tyranny side of the spectrum, in a way, the lead artist kind of becomes the director, and you may have created just a different kind of hierarchy. And you know, this is more complicated than we can talk about here, but I think some actors might argue that actually having a set script is very freeing for them and gives them a ton of authority in terms of, you know, these are my lines, this is my ownership of this part of this thing, that I can then defend against the ideas of the director. So I think kind of the questions are always alive, no matter how we're kind of defining ourselves.
Yeah, or how many times, and I'm not, what I'm about to say, I don't want to imply is the case with any of the companies you're talking about. I suspect what I'm about to say is not the case with the companies you're talking about. But, you know, how many times has there been a sort of a free give and take in rehearsal between director and designers, or cast and playwright? Great, you know, it's all awesome. It's democratic. It's this space where everybody contributes. But then the script gets published and the playwright gets credit for a bunch of other people's ideas.
Yes.
But the script is published, the playwright's name is on it, you know, and the lawsuits that we've heard about between directors and designers sometimes around, you know, well, who really gets credit for that idea? I'm not suggesting that's the case with these companies. I'm just saying that's what happens in this sort of post-production environment, where surely you've got to maintain an equal vigilance around the democratic input.
Yeah, and I think a really tangible example of this is the musical Hamilton, which probably many of you will be familiar with. Um, you know, I can't speak to any sort of deep knowledge of what the contracts are between different creators on Hamilton, but I'm aware that many of the central cast members were involved in writing their own kind of slam poetry and rapping, and in many ways authored their characters. And I don't think that they have received the credit or the compensation that maybe should go along with that. And it's interesting to me because there is a very clear central creator in that piece that we all can think of. And yet, for something that has been so commercially successful, it's kind of an extraordinary example of something that was devised. So yeah, the theater market as we know it contorts things.
That's a great example. I wouldn't say that the mainstream, whatever, conversation around Hamilton sees that as devised theater.
Yeah.
The mainstream conversation sees it as the sort of genius creation of one individual.
Yes. This is a good segue back to the
Back to you. Yes. Take us
back
to
to
the
the
next.
world of art. The City Company and Bob Rauschenberg America. This, just apologies in advance, the quality is not fantastic on this video, but it'll give you a sense.
What I like to do is, I start with anything. A picture, these colors. I like these colors. Or I might have an idea about something I'd like to try with a shoe. Or maybe I just feel happy. Look, everything overlaps, doesn't it? It's connected in some kind of way. Once you start putting it all together, it just seems obvious. I mean, tie a string to something and see where it takes you. The biggest thing is don't worry about it. You're always going to be going somewhere, so don't worry about it, see? Start working when it's almost too late at night, when your sense of efficiency is exhausted, and then just let it come on.
What I love about Bob Rauschenberg America, you know, you saw that scenic design which was the giant American flag. Everything about it is so resplendently American. And that seemed to be, I think that was Anne Bogart and the company's interpretation of part of what Robert Rauschenberg was interested in as a visual artist, taking these iconically American things and smashing them together in a collage. And that's exactly how the piece feels when you watch it. They also made a show called Hotel Cassiopeia about the artist Joseph Cornell, who, if you're familiar, made these beautiful, these kind of tiny boxes, like little light boxes that felt like little surreal worlds. And I have to say that show felt like the experience of viewing his work. They also made a show inspired by Norman Rockwell, and that was a whole other thing. I was talking about source material, different places to start from that devising companies find. And so here's an example of using visual art. Another thing I'll point to is, yeah, as I've put here, one of the things that distinguishes their rehearsal room is the designers and writers. Sometimes they have a playwright or multiple writers in the rehearsal room, watching what the actors and the director are generating. All of them are in the rehearsal room every day, and that differs from what you usually see in the playwright down model. It's more likely that you would see a designer visiting rehearsal every once in a while, maybe once a week, and then their involvement becomes a lot more intense during the technical period. They'll have meetings with the director outside of rehearsal up to that point. But in this scenario, and I think this is a good example too of, we're not just talking about the actors collectively creating the thing, we're also talking about the visual creators of the piece being right there on the ground floor. Everyone has an opportunity to influence the step-by-step making of the kind of narrative or the audience's journey. Next company, Gekko. Here is our first company that's based in the UK. They're an English company. Here is another company that really does a lot of movement, and they have been working since 2001, so kind of the last 20 years. They're really incredible, and though you can place them on that knife's edge between dance and theater, I would say that they are absolutely theater, because they are focused on character and they're focused on story. I'm going to give you a little sense of their work in a clip. What you're about to see is it's a trailer for their show Institute. And Institute is about some men who work together in a kind of corporate, a vaguely defined corporate environment. One of the men has just been broken up with, and another man is struggling in his high-stress architecture job. The scenic design of the piece is this amazing sort of story-and-a-half tall series of filing cabinets. So, you're looking at a massive stage, and every wall, it's a proscenium, and every wall surrounding the action is just filing cabinets upon filing cabinets. So let's take a look.
1, 2, 3.
Very heart-racing work. And I think, you know, you just get a little bit of an emotional sense of their work from that, but it articulates well, I think, what they're interested in. Their artistic director, he's really interested in his performers' origin stories, and a lot of their work is inspired by, if not the performers themselves, the stories of the ancestors of the performers. And there's this, the sense I get of their work is that there's so much feeling and so much heart. And what I know of their process is that they do these extended warm-ups. So they'll have sometimes like 2 hours just to warm up together. So that, of course, it's very physical, but it's also about kind of building trust and lowering inhibitions, so that the kind of improvisational movement that they find together can just kind of emerge collectively. And it's really an incredible thing. Like of all these companies, it feels like the most subconscious, like collectively subconscious process. Of course, framed and directed by this artistic director. And again, this is why this is kind of getting further towards the Tyranny side of the spectrum. But the substance is so much the stories and the bodies and the feelings of the performers. You know, as I've said here in the slide, instead of individual authorship, the group is seeking a shared impulse and trying to feel something together. Just to go back briefly to the City Company and thinking about it on that spectrum, you know, I think with that one, I've put it one notch further on from Urban Bushwomen, because though I think both of those companies have very powerful leaders, it seems to me that Urban Bushwomen is more about kind of drawing out the individual and their stories and their kind of the sensations of their life. And City Company is more about a giant vision. So Robert Rauschenberg's oeuvre, and filling, each company member contributing to filling that giant vision. But of course, someone had to decide that we're making a show about Robert Rauschenberg. So I've got one more company to talk about. And this is another British company. They're called Kneehigh. And Kneehigh is so beloved. I'm such a fan of Kneehigh. They've also toured widely in the US. I actually shadowed a production they had on at Berkeley Rep in 2011. So if anyone was following Berkeley Rep season, then they had a show called The Wild Bride that toured there. Kneehigh's been working since 1980. They're almost a household name here in the UK. one of their most famous shows is called Brief Encounter, and this is a still from that production. Brief Encounter is an adaptation of a film, the film Brief Encounter, and adaptation is a big focus of this company. Now, in just the small selection of groups that I've brought to this talk, they are the group that I put furthest towards Tyranny. And of course, it's not actually Tyranny, but Emma Rice, their artistic director, she's kind of, I mean, you could call her a writer-director. She really leads on the text of what is performed. And I know they work different ways. Sometimes she completely writes the adaptation before she comes in. They'll do adaptations of novels, of books. They'll do adaptations of films. Sometimes they've even done adaptations of beloved TV series from the 50s and 60s. They're celebrated in the UK as a really local theater company. So they started out in Cornwall, and there are aspects of their performance, particularly the song and dance, that people in the UK would recognize as distinctly Cornish. And Kneehigh is often mentioned as a kind of argument for theater, supporting theater outside of the capital city, so outside of London, bringing more support for theater in the regions. I have a little clip of Emma Rice speaking about Kneehigh's process. And I think this will give you a sense of how she really creates the container for how things are made, but then she's looking to fill that with the kind of silliness and the content generated by the actors. And something I'll say a lot about after is the idea of play. So looking for play in their processes is what we're after.
We've got 5 weeks rehearsals. Because this has been adapted, so there is a script, I'm a little bit at sea because my early work, there was no script. We just used to rock up with a scrap of paper and mess around until something happened. But now we're big and serious now, so we've got this script. And then I spend almost all my time trying to pretend that there isn't a script. So we haven't done a read through. So today is day 3 of the Kneehigh Big Brother house. And we haven't read the script yet. And I sort of hope we don't, because I feel that the minute you read a script, people think this is what I'm going to do. They go, okay, and they get their highlighters out. Literally, you see people going, that's my line, and that's what I will do, and I'm going to start learning it. And in a Kneehigh process, that's really unhelpful because everybody's going to do everything. And what you want is the thrill of surprise, because I want people to suggest to me things that I would never have thought of and bring their humanity and their humour and their angers, their passions, to show me what the story can be. So as a director, you're giving a very strong world and a very strong foundation of what it is and how you want people to be thinking, but then you have to leave oxygen around everybody so that they can surprise me, and I have to be ready to see it happening, because it might happen in a tea break or it might happen in the pub. I need to be ready to pick out the ideas and make the piece into something greater than I could have imagined, and certainly greater than what I could put down on a piece of paper.
It's telling, I think, in the way that she describes really looking to the performers for the material. She also is revealing that, of course, she is going to be the magpie. She is the one who will pick and choose what gets used and what does not. So these are my companies that I'm bringing to you today. I'll say what I was going to say about play is that one of the things I know about Kneehigh's rehearsal process is it is very silly. that kind of whatever activities are done in the room aside, I know that Emma Rice is trying to just foster constant giggling and playing and fun having in the group. And that is an end in and of itself, that actually when people are just having a good time and when they're engaged in the act of play, it kind of doesn't matter who authored what, if that makes sense. Like if you're engaged in a competition to be the most buffoonish clown, I don't know that people's egos are really involved. So there's an interesting, there's an interesting sort of tactic at play there.
Julia, thank you. Thank you. We're doing this conversation in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and just watching all these videos of the rehearsal hall and the people you're talking about makes me desperate to get back into a rehearsal space.
I know, me too. And I think another thing that I want to emphasize, and I wish we could spend another half hour talking about this, but we find ourselves in a pandemic, and we find ourselves in a movement towards anti-racism, a long overdue movement. Within the theater in the US and the UK, there are a lot of conversations about how to genuinely make theater for everyone in the country, how to genuinely democratize theater. I want to also say, you look at these companies, and with the exception of Urban Bushwomen, most of the faces that you see are white. And I think that's one form of a lack of inclusion that's quite visible just in this format. Of course, there are lots of other ways that oppression is enacted in rehearsal rooms. I said at the beginning, there's conversations around ableism and sexism and ageism, but we can see that hierarchy very clearly in these groups. And so a question that I grapple with, and it's not just these companies, I think if you look across the kind of field of experimental theater or devised theater, a lot of the artists working are white. And so the question for me is why? And I think one obvious reason is funding. And, who are the people who have access to the money to work in an unconventional way? I think in some ways we expect systems of unequal distribution of power to be very present in conventional theater, and that maybe that's disrupted in experimental theater, but actually it's not, right? It's everywhere. One of my big questions coming away from looking at all these companies is, can their work be truly non-hierarchical or truly inclusive when you look at their faces and you don't see that inclusion? What we've seen, just like in American culture at large, is within the theater industry a real movement towards trying to answer those questions and trying to get to the bottom of why some people are made to feel unwelcome. And what I'd like to direct everyone to is a website and a collective called We See You White American Theater. And I'll just screen share what that website looks like. So this is We See You White American Theater, or WAT.com. And I'm on their demands page. As you can see, it says here, as the calls for long overdue change sweep every aspect of our society, we as Black, Indigenous, and people of color theater workers are meeting the moment, developing a new social contract for our work environments that cares for and sustains our artistry and lives. And they have created a very detailed analysis of the ways in which people of color, BIPOC people, non-white people are made to feel unwelcome in all kinds of theater contexts. And I think it's all of our responsibility to study these, to have a clear sense of where we fit into these power structures. And just come back to you. Most especially those of us who are white need to very closely understand how we fit into that system of power.
Julia, thank you. That's a great point to end on, and I can share the link with students.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to do this, to talk about these various companies and to focus on such an important topic. And the point that you end on here really makes us think how important and vital it is to today's world that we think about these ways to challenge the hierarchical structures, which in many ways support a kind of white supremacy, not only in the theater space, but outside in the broader world. And that's why this conversation is really important, that we think about ways to increase the so-called democracy of a theater space. It's bigger than just the rehearsal space of that particular show, I suppose, is the point that I think you're making, and it's a great point to end on.
Absolutely. The ways in which the rehearsal room is a microcosm, is a mini version of our society. And then whatever happens in that room is directly experienced by the audience on a stage. So really there is no distinction. We are a public art form that speaks directly to people in the public sphere. So we have a responsibility to that.
Thank you again. Julia, of course, for our listeners, is joining us from London, and I'm here in California. So we have an 8-hour time difference, and it's rather getting on late for you at this stage. So thank you for taking the time here at the end of your day to share this with us. We appreciate it very much.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you.